Harrison Ford, you reveal in your book, after 40 years, is that right?
40 years I thought I'd wait.
Okay, so you reveal that you were having an affair with Harrison Ford.
I was.
You say it.
He spent 50 years building the most recognizable career in Hollywood history, and almost none of that time talking about his personal life. Harrison Ford survived the chaos of early obscurity, the vertigo of overnight global fame, the quiet dissolution of 2 marriages, and the complicated aftermath of a secret that Hollywood kept for nearly 4 decades. Now, at 83 years old, the man who once described fame as something that happened to him rather than something he pursued has finally begun to speak. And what he has said, across carefully guarded interviews and late career reflections, pulls back the curtain on chapters of his life that were long hidden behind a reputation for silence. To understand what Ford has confessed, and why it matters now more than it ever did before, you have to travel all the way back to where this story truly begins. Not on a film set, not in a casting room, but in a version of Los Angeles that felt nothing like the city of dreams. In the early 1960s, Harrison Ford was, by most measurable standards, invisible. He had arrived at acting not through passion or calculated ambition, but through a series of circumstances that left him with few other options. He taught himself carpentry and used it to pay his bills while pursuing roles that almost never materialized into anything lasting. He signed a contract with Columbia Pictures, was released without fanfare, and returned to building cabinets and working construction sites for some of the more influential names in the industry. His screen appearances were marginal, a scene here, a moment there, nothing that suggested the global icon hiding inside the working-class anonymity of his daily life. This was the version of Harrison Ford that Mary Marquardt fell in love with. She married him in 1964, when he was not famous, not wealthy, and not even consistently employed as an actor. Their relationship was built on the foundation of a life that had nothing to do with Hollywood's machinery. It was domestic, grounded, and shaped by genuine financial uncertainty rather than manufactured image. Together they had 2 sons, Benjamin Ford, born in 1966, and Willard Ford, born in 1969. 4 years, their household was the most stable thing in Ford's otherwise fragmented existence, oscillating as it was between job sites and audition rooms with no clear trajectory toward anything extraordinary. What changed everything was not a breakthrough performance or a moment of industry recognition. What changed everything was a door that carpentry opened. Ford's renovation work brought him into proximity with influential industry figures, including director George Lucas, who had already cast him in a minor role in the 1973 coming-of-age film American Graffiti. That connection planted a seed that would not fully bloom for several more years. When Lucas began assembling the cast for a new science fiction project that most people in Hollywood considered a long shot, Ford was brought in not as a candidate but as a facilitator, reading lines with other actors to help Lucas evaluate dialogue during casting sessions. What happened next was unplanned, organic, and ultimately career-defining. The sarcasm, the grounded timing, the improvisational quality Ford brought to the character of Han Solo began to reshape the role itself. Lucas recognized what he was seeing, and the decision was made. Harrison Ford, carpenter and peripheral actor, would become the face of one of cinema's greatest rogues. The production of Star Wars Episode IV, A New Hope, filmed across Elstree Studios in England and the desert locations of Tunisia in 1976, was, by most accounts, an exercise in controlled chaos. Scripts were being revised during shooting. Budget pressures created constant anxiety. Technical failures disrupted schedules. And within that atmosphere of institutional uncertainty, something else happened, something that Ford would not publicly address in any meaningful way for decades, and that the world would not fully learn about until 2016, when Carrie Fisher published her memoir The Princess Diarist. Fisher, who had been 19 years old during filming and freshly cast as Princess Leia, revealed in that book that a personal relationship had developed between herself and Ford over the course of the 3-month shoot. She had kept diary entries during production, and used them to reconstruct her emotional landscape at the time. The intensity, the isolation of being young and far from home in an unfamiliar production environment, and the complicated feelings she had carried for the older married actor working alongside her. The relationship, Fisher made clear, was brief. It did not extend beyond the duration of filming. Once production ended and the cast returned to their separate lives, so did the episode itself, at least in its immediate form. But emotionally, for Fisher, it never fully resolved. What made her account so culturally significant was not its content alone, but the silence that had surrounded it for nearly 40 years. Ford had been 33 at the time. He was married to Mary Marquardt. He had 2 young sons. And he had, by all public accounts, moved through the following decades without ever confirming the relationship existed. When Fisher's memoir was published, the media response was immediate and global. Ford, by contrast, was characteristically restrained. In interviews reported by outlets including Rolling Stone and GQ, he acknowledged that the memoir existed and that he had been made aware of it, but he declined to elaborate. He described the situation simply as feeling strange. When asked whether he had read the book, his answer was direct. He had not. He did not dispute Fisher's account. He simply refused to enter it. That refusal to engage, that practiced and almost architectural silence, had been a defining feature of Ford's public persona for decades, and it said as much about him as any confession ever could. What Ford has gradually and selectively acknowledged in later years is not so much the specifics of that period as the broader pattern it represented. The dissolution of his marriage to Mary Marquardt came in 1979, 2 years after Star Wars transformed him from a working actor into one of the most recognized faces on the planet. Ford himself has never explicitly linked the two events. He has not blamed the Carrie Fisher relationship for ending his first marriage. But in broader reflections on that era, captured across decades of interviews and carefully worded public statements, he has acknowledged the seismic disruption that sudden global fame imposed on a domestic life that had been built entirely without it. The acceleration from anonymity to icon status in the span of a single year created pressures that his marriage to Marquardt was never designed to absorb. Normal routines became impossible. Private life became a negotiation. The household that had once been the steadiest thing in his world was suddenly the thing most vulnerable to the forces surrounding it. The critical and commercial triumph of Star Wars, which earned more than $775 million worldwide across its initial release and subsequent re-releases, repositioned Ford in ways that neither he nor anyone around him had fully anticipated. He was not marketed as the film's lead. That distinction was shared more evenly across the ensemble, but audience response made Han Solo the film's breakout figure almost immediately. Studios recalibrated. Industry attention shifted. And Ford, who had spent the better part of a decade being invisible, found himself unable to move through a city without being recognized. That experience, by his own description, was disorienting rather than gratifying. He has spoken in various interviews over the years about his discomfort with the machinery of fame, the loss of privacy, the construction of a public image he neither designed nor fully endorsed. What he rarely spoke about, until much later, was the cost that machinery extracted from the people closest to him. By the early 1980s, Ford's career had not merely recovered from the uncertainty of his earlier years, it had achieved a kind of saturation that few actors in history have matched. In 1981, Raiders of the Lost Ark, directed by Steven Spielberg and produced by George Lucas, introduced Indiana Jones to the world. The film became the highest-grossing release of that year in the United States and earned 9 Academy Award nominations, winning 5. Where Han Solo had been morally ambiguous and adrift in the cosmos, Indiana Jones was grounded, intellectual, and serialized, an entirely different archetype that nonetheless arrived wearing the same face. The cultural weight of occupying both roles simultaneously was extraordinary. Ford was, at that moment, carrying 2 of the most beloved fictional identities in cinema on his shoulders, while still fundamentally insisting on a version of himself that kept the public at arm's length. In 1983, he married screenwriter Melissa Matheson, whose own career had produced some of the decade's most celebrated work, including the screenplay for E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which grossed more than $790 million worldwide. Their marriage coincided with Ford's absolute peak as a global box office force, and it produced 2 children together: Malcolm Ford, born in 1987, and Georgia Ford, born in 1990. The relationship endured for 17 years, spanning Blade Runner, the Indiana Jones sequels, The Fugitive, and the long accumulation of Ford's transformation into a living cultural institution. But it too eventually came apart. Their separation in 2000 and subsequent divorce in 2004 was handled with a privacy that was almost aggressive in its completeness. No public scandal. No defining rupture captured by the tabloid press. Just a quiet ending to a long chapter, followed by an even quieter grief that Ford would not speak about publicly, particularly after Matheson's death from neuroendocrine cancer in 2015 at the age of 65. What Ford has confessed, in the years since those losses, is not a catalogue of regrets but something more nuanced and perhaps more honest: a gradual acknowledgement that the life he built in pursuit of something he never consciously sought left a series of human consequences that no amount of box office success could fully address. He has spoken about the geographic and emotional distances created by decades of film production, the long absences from family life that accumulate almost invisibly until they become something structural rather than circumstantial. He has reflected, in the careful language of a man who chooses every word with the precision of someone who knows they will be recorded, on the cost of a career built on being everywhere while simultaneously trying to be nowhere as a recognizable figure. The stability that arrived in the third act of his personal life came from an unexpected direction. In 2002, at the Golden Globe Awards in Los Angeles, Ford met actress Calista Flockhart, who had become one of the defining television figures of the late 1990s through her role in Ally McBeal. Their relationship developed slowly, an intentional pacing that stood in marked contrast to the compressed timelines of his earlier marriages. Ford was no longer in a phase of rapid professional transformation. He was an established legacy figure operating from a position of earned security, and that stability changed the architecture of his personal life in ways that previous decades had never allowed. By 2009, he proposed. In June 2010, they married in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a deliberate choice of location, far from the media density of Los Angeles, that reinforced the controlled exposure Ford had spent years constructing as a kind of personal philosophy. He also adopted Flockhart's son, Liam, integrating himself into a blended family structure in a way that marked a genuine redefinition of his domestic identity in later life. What Ford has finally, carefully, and selectively confessed in recent years is this: that the silences he maintained for so long were not denials but decisions. He made choices about what he would protect and what he would release, and he largely held those lines for half a century. The Carrie Fisher period was real. The distance it represented from his first marriage was real. The pain of two marriages that ended without scandal but with the quiet accumulation of absence was real. And the life he has built with Flockhart, grounded in privacy and deliberate invisibility from the media machinery that once consumed everything around him, is the closest he has ever come to articulating what he actually wanted all along. Not fame, not franchise, not cultural immortality, but the ordinary weight of a life lived on his own terms, with people who knew him before the myth took over. At 83, Harrison Ford is not a man in decline. He is a man who has finally found the distance from his own story to speak about it honestly, in fragments and carefully chosen moments, without surrendering the silence that has always been his most defining characteristic. The confessions he has made are not dramatic. They do not arrive with the cinematic force of a final act revelation. They come quietly, the way truth usually does, in the spaces between the words, in the acknowledgement of what was lost alongside what was gained, and in the rare, unguarded moments when a man who spent his entire career playing heroes finally allows himself to simply be human.